4-month-old baby girl looking out on her surroundings. It's easy for us to assume that basically she understands her environment in the same way an adult does, and that the only thing she lacks is knowledge, which she is, however, continuously and busily building up. But how does she understand her world? What does she make of the objects she sees around her, her toys, her mother? These questions about her ideas, her thoughts, her impressions, about how she understands her surroundings, are questions about her mental world, about what psychologists call mental representations. The development of these representations has been of enormous interest to psychologists and philosophers for a long time.
Psychology is the study of human behavior, and psychologists of all persuasions know that human behavior is controlled by a system of representations, which we now take to be largely encoded in the brain, or indeed entirely encoded in the brain. So to study human behavior and its causes, one studies representation, how human beings represent the world. And psychologists of all persuasions also believe that the roots of our system of representation are laid down in infancy.
But how can we know what sort of mental representations babies do have? How can we find out about them? However hard we try, remembering our earliest childhood experiences seems impossible. We can't question babies about their experiences, and we can't directly observe what's going on in their minds. In this program, we look at just 2 accounts of infant representation and the methods used to explore how babies and children understand their surroundings. Both accounts suggest that the infant's mental world may not be what we assume it to be. Jean Piaget's theory has had the most powerful influence on developmental psychology over the last 60 years. Although he worked on many areas of developmental psychology, his ideas about infant representation have become the central focus for a critical debate. For Piaget, there was no doubt that the infant's world is radically different to the adult's.
The universe of the young baby is a world without objects, consisting only of shifting and unsubstantial tableaux which appear and are then reabsorbed, either without returning or reappearing in a modified or analogous form.
For Piaget, the young infant does not have mental representations and cannot form conscious memories of past events.
They don't have representations of objects, and they can't think with representations. So the newborn infant, the infant in the first 2 months, has no way of understanding, for example, the continued existence of objects when they can't be perceived directly, or they can't be acted upon. So an object that goes out of view, a parent that leaves the field of view, goes out of the room, ceases to exist. Really, what Piaget is saying is the babies come into the world with the very minimum of knowledge. They have a set of actually fairly complicated reflex activities, but these are reflexes. These are triggered by situations such as touching the baby's hand will trigger a grasping activity. Seeing something move in the front of the baby will trigger tracking. But the baby only understands very, very little of what's going on. Perceptual experiences are fleeting, they're not organized, the baby doesn't know anything about space and depth and distance, can't interpret what's happening. There is simply no understanding of the world as you or I would understand it.
Piaget's ideas about the nature of early mental representations were based on simple but careful observations of babies searching for objects that have been placed out of view.
That's good. There you are. Down here.
Piaget found that with babies like Rebecca, who's 5 months old, although she might be interested and excited by a toy, if it's then hidden while she's watching, then she behaves as if the toy simply ceases to exist. Piaget reported that there is a blank reaction. The baby just stops, doesn't know what to do, doesn't show any indication that she's aware the toy continues to exist.
Yeah. There you are. Better if you did it for this one. And we'll cover it over. If you let it come forward, see if you can find it. Where's it gone? Oh, it disappeared. Where's it gone? Oh, where's it gone? Look, here it is. Here it is.
Gradually, the baby begins to focus some attention on the cover, but only for its own sake. So the child will reach out, grab the cover, play with it in some way, and then would notice this toy, this object was hidden underneath, and would pick that up. And gradually, through this repeated experience, and also other experiences, other activities, such as the baby handling an object, moving it out of view, bringing it back in again, moving it behind something else, seeing it go out of existence, out of sight, out of existence, come back again, beginning to understand that the way to interpret what's happening is that the object does continue to exist.
For Piaget, these careful observations supported his idea that infants simply don't or can't represent things in their minds as stable, enduring objects, and that they can only develop this representation through repeated interaction with their world. But even when they do finally start searching, it doesn't mean they've fully developed the ability to represent objects.
Piaget made an important point. He claimed that when babies do begin to search, when they show evidence of being able to understand how to remove a cover and find a toy that's hidden, he was at pains to point out that this wasn't an indication that the baby was making use of a symbolic representation. The child didn't have an image of the hidden toy and was doing something to try and retrieve it. Instead, he claimed all that had been learned was the baby could carry out one activity, which was removing the cover, in order to carry out another activity, which is grabbing hold of the toy and doing something else with it, putting it in your mouth or examining it or something of that sort. And the reason for that was the what's come to be known as the classic A not B search task, which Piaget was the first to report.
Put it out of here. Cover it over.
At 8 months, Jessica has reached the point where she can complete the standard hide and retrieve task. Unlike Rebecca at 5 months, Jessica will successfully and repeatedly retrieve her toy when it's hidden in the same place.
There you got it.
Yeah, very nice.
But if the experimenter then changes where the object is hidden, Jessica will watch, but then turn back to the original hiding place and search there. For Piaget, this implied the child didn't have a mental representation of the object, but instead the object was understood in terms of the actions, sensory motor actions necessary to retrieve it, to bring it back into existence.
Well done.
Piaget argued that this is evidence that the infant is not using a symbolic representation of the toy to follow its movements and understand where it is. Instead, the problem for the infant is that the object is understood in terms of the action, or the actions that are carried out on it. And if reaching at place A uncovers the object, then that is the object, in a very real sense, for the infant in the sensory motor stage. So hiding it at place B is meaningless. The baby doesn't understand that this original object is at a new place. Instead, it reaches back to A, because that is the way the object is uncovered. That's what creates the object. And Piaget was very clear on this. He claimed that the activity of removing cover A for the infant recreates the object.
Little man down there. Cover him over.
The evidence for Piaget's ideas seems extremely robust. These observations, filmed some 60 years after Piaget first reported the behavior, show exactly the same result. And these observations have been repeated in labs all over the world. the same results are found each time. However, while the observations have stood the test of time, Piaget's theory of why infants behave as they do has been questioned. Just because they behave as if an object has disappeared doesn't necessarily imply that they really think the object has disappeared. It doesn't necessarily imply they have no mental or symbolic representations.
Piaget based the majority of his conclusions on tasks that required infants to be able to reach and grasp and pick up objects. Now, there are two problems there. One is that you're not able to test children who are younger, who are not able to reach and grasp. And we would wonder, you know, how do infants come into the world? Is he actually right about his claim that the newborn doesn't know about the permanence of objects? The second is that it's just possible infants may have a symbolic representation of the object that's been hidden, but they just don't know how to retrieve it. The toy's been covered and they don't know that all you have to do is to pick up this cover and move it away in a particular way, and there is the toy sitting there ready to be grasped. If they lack that information, then clearly they won't be able to search, but it's not because they don't have a symbolic representation, as Piaget claimed. We need some other ways of trying to find out exactly what the limits are on infants' performance.
So there are question marks over Piaget's account of infant representation. Some critics suggest that by 5 months it is possible for infants like Rebecca to represent permanent objects. What she can't do is work out a strategy to complete tasks presented to her in the experiments. The issue has still not been satisfactorily or finally resolved. But even if it was shown that infants at 5 months have some form of mental representation, Piaget may have been right about babies younger than Rebecca.
Unfortunately, we have very little information at that age. It's possible Piaget's explanation could be right for the newborn in the first couple of months. But it's such a difficult age group to study that the research hasn't yet been done, and that's something that we need to find out. More work has to be done there.
But there are other problems with Piagetian accounts of early infant representation. It's one thing to look at babies and their toys, but what about their relationships with people?
I think that the conclusion which Piaget drew, that there was a stage at which infants represented the world in this episodic way, is true and important. But I think that Piaget's own use of it was slightly thrown off by the fact that he did most of his experiments with inanimate objects. And I think that children's ways of representing animate objects, and in particular their ways of representing their mother or the people that are close to them, are distinct and different from their ways of representing objects in general.
The psychoanalytic school has always placed emotional relationships at the center of its theories. At the heart of many of Freud's ideas were the early relationships between child, mother, and father. Melanie Klein, who trained in the psychoanalytic tradition, also believed that any understanding of early experiences and representations would have to take into account the significance of infants' emotional worlds, their relationships not just with objects in general, but with people. The task then was to find a way of investigating these early relationships.